I'm Linda Calloway, 38 years old, and I spent 16 years building one of the most demanding careers in the United States military. Without ever once hearing my own mother say she was proud of me, I gave everything to that career. The early mornings, the deployments, the decisions that never made the news. And for 20 years, my mother introduced me to people as her daughter who was doing her Navy thing. Have you ever worked your entire life at something and had the people who should know you best never once ask what it actually meant? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stop waiting for someone's recognition and just live your life anyway, hit that like button and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. What happened at that Thanksgiving table is something I never expected. But the thing that changed wasn't what you'd think. My father used to say that there were two kinds of people in the world, the ones who needed the walls and the ones who needed to know what was on the other side. He wasn't a big talker. Robert Calloway was the kind of man who filled silence with presence rather than words. But on the nights when the house was quiet and the rest of the family was asleep, he would settle into his armchair with a mug of something warm and occasionally say something that landed with a weight that stayed. I was 8 years old the night he said that particular thing. We were sitting in the dark living room watching a documentary about Navy divers, deep ocean work, the kind where pressure at depth could collapse a human lung in seconds if the equipment failed. The television threw blue light across the carpet. I sat on the floor with a blanket around my shoulders and watched those divers move through black water with a kind of purposeful calm that looked, to my 8-year-old mind, like the most serious thing a human being could be doing. Something moved in me watching that. Some kind of recognition that I couldn't name and wouldn't be able to name for years. I just knew that whatever those people were, whatever they were built for, trained toward, organized around, I was made of some of the same material. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet. But I held it. I grew up in Northern Virginia, the middle child in a family of 3. My older sister, Patricia, was the steady one, kind, organized, the kind of person who made her bed every morning from the time she was 6 years old and seemed to find comfort rather than obligation in routine. She knew from early on that she wanted to take care of people. She became a nurse, eventually, and it was the most natural fit anyone in our family had ever made. My younger brother Derek was the brilliant one, sharp and perpetually ambitious, always working out the angle on the next thing, already lawyerly in temperament before he was old enough to have heard the word. He became an attorney, which surprised no one, and I was the one who ran. Not metaphorically, literally. I ran track in middle school and then cross country and then anything that required endurance and early mornings and a willingness to stay uncomfortable, long past the point where it was doing anything for me athletically. I ran because it was the only thing I did that felt proportional to whatever was in me that needed an outlet. My mother, Carol, never quite understood that, and I think it unsettled her from the beginning in ways she never fully articulated, even to herself. Carol Calloway measured the world by what it looked like from the outside. She cared about appearances, not in the shallow way people sometimes assume. She wasn't vain, exactly, not in any frivolous sense, but in a deeper and more architectural way. She believed that what you could show was what you were. A degree you could frame, a job title you could explain at a dinner party without having to pause or hedge. A life that had a legible, linear shape that other people could recognize and evaluate. Mine did not have that shape, and I think it genuinely troubled her from the time I was a teenager. She would ask what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I would say something like, I want to be good at something hard, and she would laugh, a little uncertainly, and redirect the conversation toward something manageable. Patricia would say nurse or teacher. Derek, even at 12, would say lawyer. Carol would beam at both of them with the satisfaction of someone whose children were behaving as intended. I kept saying something hard until the day I found the brochure and had a better answer. I was 14 when I found my first Naval Academy brochure in the school library. I read it cover to cover without getting up. I brought it home and left it on the kitchen table that night, not as a statement, but because I wanted it nearby. Carol saw it the next morning and said, without any particular heat, "That's cute, Linda, but girls who daydream about the military usually just end up disappointed." She said it the way she said most uncomfortable things, lightly, as if she were doing me a favor by managing my expectations before they got out of hand. My father was at the table. He said nothing while Carol was speaking. But that night he slid a second brochure, a newer edition with better photographs and updated information under my bedroom door. No note, no instruction, just the brochure, passed under a door in the dark from a man who communicated best without words. I kept it under my mattress for 2 years and read it the way other teenagers read things they needed to believe in. The summer I was 16, my track coach stopped me after a morning practice and told me I had the endurance profile of a college-level distance runner. I told him I intended to apply to the Naval Academy. He looked at me for a moment, the honest, evaluating look of an adult deciding whether to encourage or redirect, and then he said, "Then stop running like you're training for a sport. Start running like your life depends on it." I changed my cadence on the next lap and never went back to the old one. From that morning forward, I ran for something I couldn't fully name yet, and the namelessness of it was exactly what kept me from slowing down, because there was no finish line to reach and stop at. When I received my congressional nomination to the Naval Academy at 18, I told Carol at breakfast. She was pleasantly surprised, framing it almost immediately in terms she could process. "At least it's a degree." My Uncle Mike was at the table that morning, visiting between deployments. He'd been at SEAL Team 9 for 2 years by then, though I had no real understanding of what that meant yet. He was just Uncle Mike to me, broad-shouldered, quiet, with a quality of alertness that I registered without categorizing. He looked at me after Carol finished speaking and said, without any fanfare, "Annapolis, that's not nothing, kid." He said it the way he said everything, without ornament or performance, a simple fact. I put it in the same place I kept everything that mattered and held it there. The day I commissioned as an ensign, my father stood in the Annapolis sun in his good gray suit and did not say much. He didn't need to. The ceremony carried its own weight, the oaths, the salutes, the line of new officers on ground that had been consecrated to purpose for over a century. Carol attended and smiled for photographs, and afterward said, "I just needed a safe assignment, nothing dangerous." She thought the ceremony was a conclusion, a credential earned and filed. She did not understand that what I had just done, formally and under oath, was agree to walk through the wall, the one my father had been pointing at my whole life without ever calling it by name. But then she never had. The years after Annapolis belonged to a version of my life that I have never been fully able to explain to my family, and I stopped trying after the first few years. Not because the work was all classified, though some of it was, but because the gap between what I was actually doing and what they imagined I was doing had grown too wide to bridge, with the kind of words available in holiday phone calls and dinner table conversations. I entered the Naval Special Warfare Training Pipeline in the fall of 2009, and what followed was the most physically and psychologically demanding experience of my life to that point. I will not describe the specifics of it. What matters is that I came out the other side changed in the way that the training is designed to change you, not by adding something new, but by removing everything that wasn't structural. What remained was exactly what my father had been pointing at since I was 8 years old, sitting on the carpet, watching divers move through black water. The part that was built for necessary, the part that had always been there, waiting to be load tested. By 2012, I was 25 years old, and a lieutenant deployed to locations I still cannot fully describe in any open conversation, doing work that my mother, had she ever asked specifically enough to get a real answer, would have found genuinely alarming. I came home for Christmas that year looking like myself on the outside, same face, same voice, same ability to sit at the family table and pass the dishes and ask Patricia about her kids. But I had been in 2 classified operations in the previous 7 months. I had made decisions under conditions that would have been impossible to contextualize over Christmas dinner. Decisions that I carried in the specific way you carry, things that were real and serious and cannot be put down entirely. Carol introduced me to the neighbors that evening as my daughter who works for the Navy. Not serves, works, as if I were a claims adjuster in a beige office building somewhere. I remember the word landing, and I remember choosing, for the first time of what would be many, to let it go. Because the alternative, explaining, correcting, insisting on being accurately described, required energy I had already spent elsewhere. That became the shape of things. I would come home carrying something real, and my family would offer me a smaller, lighter version of my life to hold in its place. And I would take it because the argument wasn't worth having over tablecloths and holiday china. Carol told people I was in logistics, She told people I handled paperwork overseas. She described me to curious neighbors in ways that were technically consistent with working for the United States Navy and bore no relationship to anything I had actually done. When I was promoted to lieutenant commander in 2015, I called home from a base in Bahrain. Carol heard the word promotion and said she'd told the Hendersons. They'd asked what the rank meant in practical terms. She'd told them it meant more paperwork and probably more travel. I was 28 years old. I had been in combat. I had made decisions in hostile environments that would not appear on any public record and would not be discussed in any public forum. More paperwork. My father had a serious heart attack in 2016. Not fatal. He recovered, and we had him for another 6 years, but serious enough that I flew home on emergency leave and arrived to find Derek and Patricia already there, already managing. Carol was focused on the logistics of the situation: insurance, hospital schedules, Derek's work constraints, Patricia's shift rotation. She barely acknowledged me when I walked in, which I understood not as hostility, but as Carol's particular mode of crisis management. She organized the visible things because the invisible things were too large to hold. I sat with my father alone in the late afternoon, in his hospital room with the blinds half open and the institutional light coming in flat and yellow. He gripped my hand in the firm, undemonstrative way he had always communicated importance. He said, "Don't let her dim it." He did not name what my mother did not call it anything, which was consistent with who he was. He just told me not to let it work on me. I pressed his hand back and said I wouldn't. By 2018, I was a commander, briefly home before assuming command of an NSW squadron, a serious command, the kind of billet you spend years building toward. Derek was engaged, and his fiancée Rachel was the kind of person who asked genuine questions at dinner. What everyone did, what they found meaningful about it, where they imagined themselves going. When the question reached me, Carol moved in smoothly with her usual redirection. "Linda's in the Navy. She's in logistics." I was wearing commander's rank. I had just come off a deployment cycle spanning 4 countries. Derek added that I traveled a lot, for work, and Rachel nodded and moved on, and I ate my dinner and said nothing and thought about the run I'd take the following morning, which was the only thing in that house that was proportional to who I actually was. In 2020, I made captain. I texted the family group chat. 3 responses came in that day. Carol's came 4 days later. "That's wonderful. Does that mean you'll be home more often?" I turned my phone face down on the desk and returned to my briefing materials. I had been making a quiet decision, incrementally, over the years, to stop needing her to understand, to stop carrying the weight of her not seeing as though it were a problem I was responsible for solving. It was not. It never had been. And the person who might have served as translator between us, my father, with his brochures and his late-night documentaries and his 2 kinds of people, was not well enough anymore to carry that role, and I wasn't going to ask him to. The distance between who I was and who my family believed me to be had become, by that point, simply a feature of my life. Not a wound, not a crisis, just a fact I had organized myself around. I lived on my side of it. My real life was there, and it was full and serious and did not require witnesses from that particular direction in order to be real. Thanksgiving, 2025. I drove up to Northern Virginia the night before and arrived late, which was how I always arrived, late enough to avoid being the emotional center of anyone's arrival, early enough to be useful with the setup in the morning. The house still had my father's things in it, in specific small ways that my mother had preserved without discussion. His armchair, his section of the bookshelf in the den, the spines undisturbed, the particular arrangement of objects on his workbench in the garage that nobody had moved in 3 years. She'd loved him in her own practical, unsentimental way, and the loss had carved a quiet out of her that none of us named directly. The chair at the table was the closest thing to acknowledgement any of us had offered. The back lawn in the morning was the setup my mother had been running every November since before I was born. The specific, expert deployment of a household Thanksgiving. Long folding tables positioned under the bare Virginia oak trees, the branches stripped to their architecture by the November cold. Orange tablecloths weighted with the good silverware, plastic tubs of whipped cream stacked at the dessert end of the long table. Folding chairs arranged with the precise social logic she applied to everything she organized. The sky was that particular pale November blue that carries no warmth in it, high and clear and cold. My breath came out visible. I found the work gloves in the garage and helped carry chairs from the basement without anyone asking, which was what I always did. Found the physical work and got into it because simple, purposeful effort was the easiest way I knew to be in a family space without requiring anything from anyone. Patricia arrived with her children and we worked side by side through the mid-morning, and she told me about her promotion at the hospital, and I listened and asked real questions, and it was easy the way that time with Patricia was often easy, uncomplicated, warm, not requiring any of us to account for the gaps between who we were and who we were supposed to be. Her kids helped carry folding chairs and argued about which end of the table they wanted, and Carol directed all of it with the competent precision of a woman who had been running this particular event for 30 years. It was a good morning, in the way that mornings can be good when all you're doing is carrying chairs. Uncle Mike came through the back gate just before noon. I was finishing the last of the place settings at the far end of the long table when I heard the gate latch and looked up. He came across the lawn in civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark fleece jacket, hiking boots with actual wear on them, and he had the quality I'd come to know well after 4 years of serving alongside him, a kind of ambient stillness that looked like ease, but was actually the condensed habit of a man who had spent 2 decades in environments where inattention had consequences. Long-service operators carry it in the body. You can see it if you know what you're looking at. He crossed the lawn and his eyes landed on me at the far end of the table and went still for 1 precise second. Not startled, just stilled. The kind of pause only I would register as significant. Then he kept walking, crossed to my mother, accepted the beer she pressed into his hand, and started talking to my cousin Marcus. Mike Walsh was my mother's younger brother and had been a Navy SEAL for 22 years. A Master Chief Petty Officer, E9, the highest enlisted rank with the kind of service record that doesn't get introduced at family gatherings. What my mother did not know, had never known because she'd never asked and I had never said, was that for the last 4 years, Mike had served under my command. He was the senior enlisted advisor for SEAL Team 9. I was the commanding officer of SEAL Team 9. We had worked out the protocol for family events the first time he came aboard, in the first week of my command, when it became apparent that this particular situation was going to require a clear agreement. No rank in family settings, no operational discussion, no salutes, no ma'am, nothing that would require either of us to explain ourselves to Carol. Thanksgiving was just Thanksgiving. The protocol had held for 4 years because my mother had never connected the two of us professionally, and I had never given her the information that would have let her. We sat down to eat in the early afternoon, the full family arranged along the outdoor tables in the cold autumn light. My mother at the head of the table as she always was. Me at the far end beside my father's empty chair. He'd died of cardiac complications in the spring of 2022, and nobody had said anything about the empty chair, but everyone had arranged themselves around its absence in the unconscious way that grief settles into the furniture of ordinary life. The conversation moved the way it always moved at these gatherings. Derek's firm, Patricia's kids, Marcus's new apartment, Carol's book club, the usual accounting of the year. When the conversation worked its way to me, as it always eventually did, Carol stepped in before I'd finished drawing breath to respond. "Oh, Linda's still doing her Navy thing," she said, the warm, slightly rueful tone she used for harmless family eccentricities. "You know, whatever that is." There was polite laughter, easy, not mean-spirited, the laughter of people who'd heard the line before and found it comfortably familiar. I had been back from a command rotation in the Pacific for 11 days. I had authorized 3 operational directives in the previous month. I looked at my plate and I ate my turkey and I said nothing, and the conversation carried on around me, and that was fine. Dessert came out in the mid-afternoon, pumpkin and pecan, the plastic tubs of whipped cream, the everyday forks. The temperature had dropped a few more degrees as the sun moved lower through the bare oaks, the light going thin and gold and hard. Most of the extended family had migrated inside by then for warmth. The core family remained at the outdoor table. My mother, Mike to her immediate left, Derek and Rachel across from me, Patricia beside them, and me at the far end next to the empty chair. I was looking at my slice of pie when I heard my mother lean toward Mike and begin to speak. The low, confiding whisper she used for things she considered understood. Established truths she was comfortable sharing because they'd been true long enough to have lost their edge. Don't mind Linda, she said. She's the embarrassment. She said it the way you'd describe a piece of outdated furniture to a visitor who'd seen the house before. Lightly, familiarly, with a kind of resigned ownership. Not cruelty. Something almost like fond practicality. A fact she'd made peace with years ago. 38 years old and still playing soldier. A sound, her fork, then nothing. Because Mike had gone completely still. His fork had stopped in midair. His shoulders, which had been carrying the deliberate relaxation of a man who was off duty and intended to remain that way, had shifted by some small and specific degree. The micro-adjustment of a person who has just been given information they cannot let pass without response. He set his fork down. The movement was slow and deliberate, the way you set something down when you need a moment before you speak. He did not look at me. He looked at Carol. Carol. Very quiet, precise. My mother turned. She registered something in his face, the particular blankness that replaces humor in a person who has stopped finding something funny, and her expression shifted in response. Carol, he said, she runs my unit. The outdoor table went silent in the full sense of that word. Not a pause in conversation, a cessation. The oak branches moved somewhere above us, yes, ma, from the direction of the street, the faint distant sound of a passing car. Nothing else. My mother blinked. What do you mean? She's the commanding officer of SEAL Team 9, he said without any softening. I am her senior enlisted advisor. I answer to her. Derek set his fork down. Rachel went still. Patricia looked between Mike and me and then at our mother. I had not moved. I was looking at the orange tablecloth, at the folding table surface beneath it, at the ordinary weave of fabric under an ordinary plate. I thought about my father's empty chair to my left. I thought about the word embarrassment in my mother's voice. Worn smooth, habitual, a thing said enough times to have lost any remaining bite. Become simply a category she had assigned me and stopped revisiting. I did not look up. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. I left before the pie tins were put away. I said goodbye to Patricia's kids, carried a stack of plates inside from the yard, set them next to the kitchen sink, found my coat and my keys. My mother was in the kitchen when I came through. She looked at me with the expression of a person still assembling information into a shape that made sense. I told her it had been a good Thanksgiving. I told her I would drive safe. I walked through the garage and out to my car in the cold November dark and pulled out of the driveway and got onto the southbound highway. The drive from Northern Virginia to Virginia Beach is about 3 hours in ordinary traffic. The night roads were clear and quiet. I called Sasha from the highway somewhere around the 2-hour mark, which was my standard practice after any family event that required more processing than I could manage alone in a car without company. Sasha Klein had been my closest friend since our first year at Annapolis. We had commissioned the same year, diverged quickly in specialty. She had gone into intelligence work, then transitioned to a consulting role, then to a contractor position in Northern Virginia that she said was more honest than government work, by which she meant it answered to fewer people whose priorities she found baffling. And we had stayed close through 2 decades of careers that had taken us in entirely different directions. She picked up on the second ring, which was her standard. Mike told her, I said. A pause. On Thanksgiving, she said. Not quite a question. Yeah. Was it bad? I thought about it for a moment, the outdoor table going silent, the oak leaves moving. My mother's face rearranging itself in real time, the way faces do when information arrives that requires old certainties to be moved. No, I said. That's the thing. It wasn't bad. It was just quiet. I got home close to midnight. I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with one lamp on and did nothing for a while except sit. The framed photograph I had carried to every posting since commissioning was on the kitchen counter, still waiting to go up on the new wall. A photo from my commissioning day. Me and my father standing side by side in the Annapolis sun, both of us in our good clothes with our hands at our sides, which was how we both preferred to exist in photographs. I sat with that photograph for a long time, and I had the conversation with Robert Calloway that I'd been having since 2022, the one-sided one, the one I held up both ends of, that had become more valuable to me precisely because it required nothing from him, because he got to simply receive it. I told him what had happened at the outdoor table. I told him Carol knew now. I told him I didn't know if it would change much, but she knew. She called the morning after. Her voice had the careful, calculating quality of someone who has been wrong in public and is working out the exact arithmetic of acknowledgement. "I just want you to know I didn't mean any harm," she said, which was both true and beside the point. I waited. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she asked. "I did tell you," I said. "You just never asked what it meant." "Well, I didn't know," she said. "How was I supposed to know?" I thought about that for a moment, honestly. She wasn't entirely wrong in the narrow sense. I had protected myself with vagueness for years, not out of operational security mostly, but out of something older and more habitual. The understanding that she had never asked the follow-up question, and so there was no point preparing the follow-up answer, because the conversation would never reach the point where the answer was wanted. I had adjusted to the available appetite and stopped offering more. "You didn't know," I said, "but you didn't want to know. There's a difference." She had no ready response to that. We talked a few more minutes and said goodbye without fully resolving anything, which was how those conversations went. On Monday morning, Mike appeared at my office doorway at his usual hour, in uniform, at attention, the posture of a man who had decided he owed a formal accounting. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. That was not the time or the place." "Stand at ease, Mike." He did. I looked at him across the desk for a moment. "Did I give you a direct order to stay quiet?" I asked. "No, ma'am." "Then you didn't break protocol. You told the truth. In my family, that's been a limited resource." Something moved across his face, the specific, contained movement that served him as a smile in professional settings. He was a good man, Mike Walsh. He was a good SEAL and a good senior enlisted advisor, and I'd come to understand over 4 years of serving alongside him, a genuinely good person in the fullest sense of that phrase. Someone who paid attention to what actually mattered and acted on it when it counted. Most people, faced with that moment at the Thanksgiving table, would have let it pass. Would have found some way to smooth over the moment and protect the comfortable fiction. Mike hadn't done that. He'd told the truth in the one sentence that needed to be said, and he'd done it without theater, without announcement, without even looking at me. That was the most military thing about it. The economy, the precision, the willingness to spend exactly what the situation required, and not one word more. That evening I ran the base perimeter route in the cold and the dark, the November air sharp enough in the lungs to register. I ran the way I'd been running since I was 16, not for time, not for distance, not for any athletic metric, but for the thing underneath the running that Coach Tanner had named accidentally and correctly all those years ago. It wasn't grief I was running through that night. It was something older and less dramatic than grief. The specific weight of a thing you've been keeping in a drawer since you were 14, the feeling of not being seen by someone who should have looked, folded up and stored because you didn't know what else to do with it, because you thought you might need it later. And then one day you open the drawer, and the thing inside doesn't weigh what it used to. You take it out and you hold it, and you let it go. Not dramatically. Just as a simple act of release, the way you release anything you've been carrying long enough. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, my mother began calling more often. The conversations had a different texture. She asked about SEAL teams, about command structure, about what a CO's day actually looked like, about whether the work was dangerous. I answered her questions honestly and briefly, but I noticed as the calls went on that she was learning the credential rather than the person. She was discovering what Linda Calloway was, a title, a rank, a category that had social weight rather than who Linda Calloway was. I recognized the distinction because I'd been watching the difference my whole life. The way some people look at a uniform and see the human being inside it, and the way others look at the same uniform and see only what it represents. My mother was doing the second thing, and I wasn't sure she was capable yet of doing the first, but she was trying, in her way, and I decided to give the trying its due. Derek emailed me in the first week of December. The subject line was a single word, "Hey," and the body was one paragraph. He said he hadn't known. He said he should have been more curious. He said he was proud of me. The phrasing was imperfect in the way of a person making a first honest attempt, the sentences a little stiff, the emotions slightly ahead of the available vocabulary. But it was real. I could tell the difference between the real thing and the performance of it, and this was the real thing. I sat with it for a day before writing back, because I wanted my response to honor the effort of his. Sasha came down to Virginia Beach in mid-December, which she did periodically. She claimed Virginia Beach had the best version of the kind of restaurant she liked, which was untrue, but the drive gave her an excuse to come. We sat on my balcony in the cold because she maintained, without ever having defended the position, that good conversations required outdoor air. I opened a bottle of something reasonable, and we sat with our coats on. "Are you going to give her the pride she hasn't earned?" she asked. She meant Carol. I thought about that for a while. "I'm going to give her a chance," I said. "Not because she earned it, because I'm not carrying that weight anymore." "That's either very evolved or very tired," Sasha said. "Probably both," I said. "Probably," she agreed, and we sat with that. At a family Christmas gathering in mid-December, Carol introduced me to a few of her book club friends who were at the house for pre-holiday drinks. She had done this hundreds of times over the years, and I had always been aware of the specific way she navigated it. The vague framing, the quick redirect, the emphasis on anything other than what I actually did. This time was different, she said, simply and directly. "This is my daughter Linda. She commands a SEAL team." One of the women looked genuinely impressed. Another said she hadn't known women could do that. I smiled and accepted a glass of wine and didn't explain further because the words had been said correctly and that was what mattered. Whether she fully understood what they meant was a separate question, but she'd said them, and I could be patient about the rest. My command rotation orders arrived in the last week of December. The transition out of Team 9 was standard career management, the right amount of time in a command billet, followed by a handoff and a lateral step to the next assignment. I had been selected for a senior billet at Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters, which was a meaningful step in the structure, and which would be different work. More strategic, less operational, more meetings, and fewer mornings in the field. I read the orders at my desk and felt the particular weightlessness that comes when a chapter you've been living inside starts to become one you'll look back on. I thought about the team. I thought about the specific faces of the people I'd built something with over 4 years, the operators, the staff, the people who'd trusted me with the weight of the work. I thought about what it meant to hand that to someone else. And then I closed the folder and went back to work because the chapter wasn't finished yet. And I had never been a person who let the ending distract from the time that remained. I was not thinking about my family. I was thinking about what came next, and about the difference between leaving something and finishing it. A difference that matters, and that I had finally learned to honor. There is a particular discipline required to close a chapter you've been living inside. Not the discipline of ending, endings come on their own schedule, but the discipline of being fully present in the remaining time rather than spending it in anticipation of what comes after. I had learned that discipline over 20 years of command, over every deployment and rotation and transition, and I applied it now deliberately. Team 9 was still mine for a few more months. The people in that building were still my responsibility, and I intended to honor that fully until the moment the handoff was complete. The new assignment could wait, the family could wait. The processing of everything that had happened in the previous 2 months could continue in the background, which was where it belonged. The foreground still had work in it. The new year started in the full rhythm of operations. January was early briefings and cold waterfront PT, and the specific fatigue that accumulates in a command billet in its final stretch, when you are simultaneously running at full speed and beginning the mental work of handoff. I was back in the compartments I was built for, and the clarity that operational tempo provides had returned and organized things. The domestic recalibration of the holiday season had retreated to its proper place. Then my mother posted on social media. Sasha texted at midnight. "Your mom just posted about you being a SEAL CO on Facebook. 200 likes." I read the text from my bed and stared at the ceiling for a moment. "I'm going to need a longer run tomorrow," I texted back. I understood the impulse behind what she'd done. She had discovered something she was proud of, and she had done with it what she did with every other thing she was proud of. Held it up for people to see. Patricia's nursing certification, Derek's bar results, the graduation photographs and the wedding photos, and the grandchildren's report cards. She shared what she was proud of because that was her mode. She hadn't asked whether this particular thing was hers to share, because it hadn't occurred to her that it might not be. That was the specific part that sat with me. Not the post itself, but the assumption underneath it that my life had become available for display because she had decided to be proud of it. I called her in the morning and kept my voice level and my words clear. "Mom, the post needs to come down." I was just proud. "I know, but my role requires discretion. I need you to ask me before you share information about my command publicly. You understand?" She took it down. She didn't call for 3 days. Aunt Ruth, my mother's older sister, 68, the sharper and more direct of the two, called within the hour of seeing the post before it was deleted. She had always assumed I was in the Navy offices somewhere and had never pushed the question further. She asked now if it was true. I confirmed that it was. "How does a mother not know her daughter commands a SEAL team?" she asked with the blunt, honest bewilderment of someone who was asking a real question rather than a rhetorical one. "Because she never asked," I said. And I never felt safe enough to just say it. A pause. "Fair enough," she said. Derek and I had dinner in January, just the two of us, at a restaurant near his office in D.C. I had been avoiding doing this for years without fully admitting that I was doing it, because real conversations with Derek required a kind of openness that family events didn't, and I had defaulted to the armor that family events allowed. He came to the dinner ready to actually try, which I could tell immediately. He asked good questions, what a command rotation meant in practical terms, what my days actually looked like, what the transition to the headquarters billet would involve. He listened when I answered. At the end of the evening, setting his wine glass down and looking at the table in the way people look when they're about to say something they've been working up to, he said he thought he'd been measuring himself against me the wrong way his whole life, that he'd been using the wrong metric, that he'd believed he was ahead of me, the degree, the career trajectory, the visible markers of a legible success, and had only recently understood that he'd been measuring things that weren't comparable. I looked at him across the table. My younger brother, 34 years old, still recalibrating. I felt something that required difficulty before it could open, the kind of affection that has scar tissue in it, that is more solid for having been tested. "You've got time," I said. He nodded. We ordered dessert. By late January, I was in full operations tempo, and the friction that had defined too many years of my life, the gap between who I was at work and who I was in my family's version of me, had gone quiet. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't, fully. But because I had stopped making its resolution a prerequisite for walking into a room as myself. The two versions had always been the same person. I'd just been waiting for someone else to confirm that before acting like it was true. The waiting was done. I thought about this sometimes during the morning runs that month, the particular irony of spending so many years of a successful career carrying the weight of someone else's incorrect opinion of it. The opinion had never affected my work. I had been good at the job regardless, but it had occupied space that I could have used for something else. And I was aware now, without bitterness, of the cost of that. Not a wasted career, nothing like that. Just a private tax I'd been paying for years without accounting for it, and the relief of finally closing the account. There is a specific kind of freedom that comes when you stop needing a particular witness. The work doesn't change, the quality of the days doesn't change, but the weight of them does, and the difference is not small. I ran my loops, and I breathed the cold January air, and I felt the difference in each stride. And I was grateful for it in the quiet way I was grateful for most things, privately, fully, without requiring it to be witnessed. Carol asked if she could visit in February. She said she wanted to see where I worked, not the classified areas, just something she could look at and put in context. I said yes, because it was a real ask and deserved a real answer. She arrived on a Wednesday, I picked her up at the airport, and we were both slightly formal on the drive in, two people who had decided to try at something and were still working out the mechanics of what trying looked like in practice. She looked smaller at the airport than the version I'd been carrying in my head. Not older, not diminished, just smaller, actual size. The way people look when you stop measuring them by the weight they've had in your life and start looking at them as they actually are. I took her to the accessible areas of the naval base. The main gate, the training grounds at a distance, the perimeter road that ran along the edge of the operational areas. She saw a unit of operators in full kit running in formation across a wide drill field and went quiet in the way people go quiet when something they'd held as abstraction becomes real in front of them. "Those are yours?" she asked. "Some of them. They're just kids. They're some of the best trained people in this country," I said. They've been doing this since they were younger than you think." She was quiet for another moment. "And you lead them," she said. It wasn't a question. She had finally stopped asking it as one, which mattered. We had dinner at a waterfront restaurant that evening, and she asked me to walk her through my career from the beginning. I did, calmly, chronologically, the way I'd brief a principal on something important. Annapolis, the NSW pipeline, the first deployments, the promotions, the command. I watched her face move through the information. There were moments where she visibly flinched at the parts that involved active danger. Twice she looked as if she might cry, and each time she pulled it back without making it a thing. I kept going because she needed to hear it in the right order, needed to hold the full chronology rather than the fragments she'd been carrying for years. "I keep thinking about every time I said playing soldier," she said when I'd finished. "You didn't know." "I didn't want to know," she said. "There's a difference." I looked at her across the table. "Yeah," I said. "There is." She'd finally said it, the same distinction I'd been holding for months, the one I'd said to myself the morning after Thanksgiving. She'd arrived at it on her own, which meant something. I didn't say that. I just held it. The next morning, Sasha joined us for coffee at a place near the waterfront. Sasha was warm and direct in the way she was always direct, and she told my mother plainly that Linda was the most respected officer she'd worked alongside in 20 years. Carol absorbed that without deflecting or minimizing. She held it and let it settle. Afterward, walking back to my car through the cold harbor air, Carol reached over and took my hand. We were on a sidewalk with the flat gray water visible between buildings, and I had not held my mother's hand since I was 9 years old when she'd gripped it crossing a parking lot, and I'd spent the next few years trying to get away from the habit because I was old enough to find it embarrassing. "I'm sorry for the word embarrassment," she said. "I know. Not just for saying it, for thinking it." I looked at her. "Yeah," I said. She flew home the next day. At the airport drop-off, she hugged me the way she hadn't in years. Not the performance of closeness, but the actual thing, the kind of embrace that communicates something words are still working up to. She said to call when I could. She said she knew I couldn't always. She said, "I'm proud of you." I should have said that 20 years ago. I drove back to the base in the early morning, with the sun coming up over the water, and I felt something close. Not everything resolved, not the whole history restored. But the specific part of it that had required me to carry it alone, that part was finished. I could set it down now. Not because it had been repaired exactly, but because it no longer needed me to keep it upright. By March, the Team 9 transition was fully in motion. The next CO had been selected, someone I respected, someone who would take care of the team the way it deserved to be taken care of, and the handoff was underway. I had been selected for the senior headquarters billet at Naval Special Warfare Command. A step up in the organizational hierarchy that would mean different work. More strategic, more administrative, less time in the field. Clean work, important work. I could see it clearly from where I stood. My final command assessment came in late March. Rear Admiral James Keller, the NSW commander, 54 years old, the kind of flag officer who gave evaluations plainly and without rhetoric, reviewed 4 years of my performance in Team 9, and then shook my hand and said, "The team is better for having had you. The command is going to be lucky." I had received a lot of evaluations in 20 years of service. That one landed differently, not because it was the most formal or the most technically precise, but because I had actually earned it, and I knew it. Without any version of myself standing to the side of the room, working to argue otherwise. The last dinner with the Team 9 senior staff was quiet. No ceremony, no formal remarks, no plaques or presentations. Just the people who had run with me for 4 years, a good table at a restaurant near the base, and the kind of conversation that happens when a group of people who have been through real things together are marking an ending without wanting to call it that out loud. Mike was at the far end of the table, and he raised his glass toward me and said, "You didn't just run the unit, ma'am. You built it into something." I didn't know whether I was the best commanding officer SEAL Team 9 had ever had. That wasn't for me to say. I had made mistakes. I had made decisions I would carry the rest of my life and revisit in the way you revisit things that mattered. But I had given the team everything I had, and in the military, as in most endeavors, that is not always sufficient, but it is always true, and the truth of it was enough. I called Carol from the parking lot outside the restaurant that same evening, sitting in my car with the engine off and the cold working into the windows. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked about the transition, about what the new role would look like, about whether I'd be in less danger, which was still her primary organizing metric for my career. Near the end of the call, she said Uncle Mike had called her after Thanksgiving. She said he'd called to tell her she'd spent 20 years failing to see her own daughter. Long pause. He was right, she said. I sat with that. It isn't all resolved, I said, because it wasn't. But we're talking now. That's a beginning I didn't have a year ago. That's something, she said. Yeah, I said. It is. There is a particular kind of telephone call that only becomes possible after something has been broken and is being, carefully and without guarantees, rebuilt. The call has a different quality than the ones before it. Less careful, more actual, the pauses meaning something different than they used to. This call was that kind. I sat in the parking lot after hanging up and didn't immediately start the car. I sat for a moment with the specific feeling of a thing that is not yet finished, but is, for the first time, heading somewhere real. I walked through the Team 9 building one final time in the first week of April. Not ceremonially, just walking, slowly, through the spaces I'd occupied for 4 years. The operations center with its familiar organized chaos. The training bay with its particular institutional smell. The armory, the briefing rooms where the serious work had been done, at hours that didn't have names. The building was alive, my people moving through it, preparing for the transition, beginning the work of introducing themselves to the incoming CO. I didn't stop anyone or make any announcement. I just walked and watched. I was not sentimental about the walls or the building or the institution. I was sentimental about what had happened inside it, the decisions made at 2 a.m. when the options were all difficult, the operators who had come home from deployments and the ones who had not, the kind of work that doesn't appear in public accounts and was never meant to. My last night in the office, I wrapped the Annapolis photograph for the move. I held it for a moment before I wrapped it in the tissue paper I'd saved for exactly this kind of packing. My father in his good gray suit. Me in my new uniform. Both of us with our hands at our sides because we were both people who didn't require physical punctuation to mean what we meant. He died in 2022 and never got to see any of it. Not the command, not the team, not the Thanksgiving that shifted something between me and my mother. I thought about that as I wrapped the photograph, thought about whether he would have wanted to see it, whether it would have meant what I wanted it to mean to him. And I decided, yes, he would have been quiet about it, the way he was quiet about everything important. 2 kinds of people, and the walls, and what's on the other side. He had known which kind I was before I could articulate it myself. He had never needed a ceremony or a confirmation to say so. He just slid a brochure under a door in the dark and waited, and was right. Spring, a new office at NSW Command Headquarters, a new routine, a different quality of work. More meetings, more strategic level coordination, less field time, the shape of a career in its next phase. I walked into those rooms without checking my right to be there, without any version of myself cataloging the justification. That shift had occurred somewhere between November and now, at some specific morning I couldn't identify, and it was simply the way I moved. Mike transferred to a new posting in the first week of April. We had coffee at a diner near the base, the kind of diner with vinyl booths and reliable coffee and nobody paying attention to anyone else's rank, and talked for an hour. He said he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner at those family dinners over the years. I told him he hadn't broken anything. He said he could have fixed it sooner. I said some things take the time they take. Then he said, "For what it's worth, your father would have been insufferably proud." I laughed. Actually laughed. The kind that arrives without preparation. That means something is genuinely true and genuinely funny at the same time. Insufferably. As if my father, who had barely said anything about my career in 20 years of it, would have made it insufferable. But the word was right, I thought. He'd have been quietly impossible about it. He'd have found some way to be still and proud simultaneously. That would have communicated everything without saying anything. Mike gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd misplaced. Not my mother's approval. I'd made peace with the loss of that long before it returned, and the peace was genuine rather than resigned. But the image of my father being proud of me, that one I had somehow lost along the way, in the years of running and working and carrying the weight of the family's not seeing. Mike handed it back across a vinyl diner table with a single sentence, and I was grateful for it in a way that didn't require explanation. My new apartment was closer to headquarters. I spent a Sunday afternoon in mid-April unpacking the things I'd carried from posting to posting for 16 years, the accumulated portable objects of a life organized around frequent relocation. Some things were purely practical. Some were photographs. The Annapolis photograph went on the wall first, as it always did, because it had been the first thing I unpacked at every posting since commissioning. Next to it, I hung a group photograph of the Team 9 senior staff taken on a training field 3 summers ago, everyone squinting slightly into a bright summer sky. I stepped back and looked at both of them together. My father and me at the beginning, the team and me near the end of a chapter. I am my father's daughter, and I am entirely my own person. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Both of them have always been true. I spent too many years treating them as if they were in competition, as if being legible to him or to my family required me to be a smaller version of what I was, or as if being fully myself required me to leave them behind. Neither thing was accurate. I just hadn't been able to see it clearly until recently. Carol called that same Sunday morning while I was still moving things around the apartment. We talked for an hour, the longest, easiest phone call we'd had in years, possibly in my adult memory. We laughed twice, actually laughed at things that were genuinely funny, rather than things we were laughing at to fill the silence. At the end of the call, she said she'd been thinking about all the years she hadn't asked what I was doing, hadn't asked what it meant, hadn't asked what kind of person her middle child was growing into. I told her we'd both done some version of that. She said maybe, but she'd done more. I said maybe and told her we had now. She will never fully understand what I do or why I do it. The frame for it doesn't exist in her world, and she doesn't have the language for it, and I've stopped needing her to build one. What I have instead is a mother who is trying, who asks real questions now instead of offering comfortable fictions, who calls more often than she used to, who said I'm proud of you and meant it without needing anything in return from me, not even acknowledgement of the cost of saying it. That is not everything. It is not the complete repair of decades of distance and mischaracterization. But it is something real, and something real was all I ever actually needed it to be. I ran that morning along the waterfront near my new apartment. A clear spring morning, cold still in the early hours, the light coming in low and gold off the water, the air carrying the clean sharpness of a Virginia April before the warmth arrives fully. I passed junior sailors running their morning PT in formation along the path. One of them caught sight of my captain's eagles and came briefly to attention as I ran by. I nodded once without breaking stride and kept going. I used to believe the point of all of it was to arrive somewhere. At the rank, at the recognition, at the specific moment when someone who should have seen you finally does. I used to think that was what I'd been running toward all those years since I was 16 years old on a track in Virginia, listening to a coach tell me to run like my life depends on it. But that was never the point. The point was the running itself. The long, steady, deliberate practice of becoming the person you already were, of loading the structure and finding its sound, of testing the thing your father saw in you before you could see it yourself and discovering that he was right. I am Linda Calloway. I am a United States Navy captain. I am the former commanding officer of SEAL Team 9. I am my father's daughter and my mother's finally understood child. I am built for necessary. I have always been. I kept running. The water was to my left and the sun was ahead, and I wasn't arriving anywhere in particular. I was just moving forward at the pace I'd always kept, in the direction I'd always known. That, finally, was enough. Not the recognition from my mother, which had arrived late, but had arrived. Not the headquarters billet, or the captain's eagles, or the team I'd built and handed forward. Not even the memory of my father, which I carried the way you carry the best things, with gratitude, without clutching. All of those things were part of it, but none of them were the point. The point was this: the long, steady willingness to keep going in the direction you're built for, regardless of whether the people you love are watching from the same direction. That willingness is not something you earn or achieve. It is something you practice every morning at whatever pace the day asks of you. I'd been practicing it my whole life. I intended to keep going. If you've made it to the end of this, thank you. Genuinely. But here's what I keep coming back to. I spent so many years waiting to be seen by the right person in the right way, and the whole time the work was just happening, the career, the command, the team I built. None of it needed her to understand it in order to be real. So if you have someone in your life who has never really asked who you are, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you have someone who got it wrong for years and finally came around, I'd love to hear that too. Drop it below. What would you have done sitting at that table? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed quiet the way I did? Let me know. And if this story hit something real for you, subscribe and hit the bell.